call this meeting of the Governance Committee to order. We'll start with a roll call. Councilor Tabor.
Present.
Councilor Lombardi.
Here.
And I'm a Councilor Cook, and I'm present as well. We're going to start today with a continued discussion of committees and ordinances review. I am going to start by sharing my screen with everyone so everyone can see it up on the board. And then anyone also on Zoom, which I don't think we actually have anyone on Zoom joining us today, but if anyone does join us, they will be aware of what we're discussing. And I should also note that this language has not been shared with the committee. We're in a very preliminary stage. And so of discussing this, so it's not something that was in the agenda packet. It's not something that has been distributed anywhere. This is just generally language that we're trying to finesse first before we get to that stage. So so this is very preliminary discussion. Let me see if I can share my screen. Here we go. So we had discussed in the past a potential option, wait, I think this is wrong. No, that's right. A potential option of allowing the mayor to appoint people on a stagger to help fix the challenges we have around so many committees, and it's a lot of committees that we have right now, that the stagger's off, and therefore we lose expertise. Unfortunately, the majority of expertise on a committee in 1 year sometimes. So this is an effort to try to offer a solution to that problem. And the language that we were currently looking at is essentially a simple phrase, adding a simple phrase at the end of Section A of Section, or Point A under Section 1.302 in the ordinance, and this is the board's ordinance, Article 3, for those at home. If the rotation of the membership terms is not staggered, the mayor shall shorten the term of the subsequent appointee by whatever timeframe necessary to maintain the rotation of the terms envisioned in the ordinance. So this was kind of the recommendation that had come from governance to go to legal and have legal look at it. I think we're still working on that process. Is that accurate?
Yes, we are. So it's going to be legal determination or statutory interpretation for the land use boards anyways, because the statute for the land use boards requires that the terms be for 3 years. But it also requires that they be staggered so that no more than 3 people are appointed in any given year, which apparently somehow we're off the mark for that stagger. So the question is, will the statute allow a shortening, or would it require a lengthening of a current term in order to effectuate that? The committees, I think, it's just a matter of changing the ordinances, most likely.
Thank you. And I think that that's what we're trying to make sure that we have in my discussions with the legal department, a clear understanding of what the mayor's requirements would be. That would mean, for example, if, depending upon what we determine is the state RSA that comes up, when an appointment comes up on a land use board, which these are really the only boards that we have to be cautious about because there's RSA governing it and there's ordinance governing it, that we make sure that we're following the RSA when the mayor says, okay, this next appointment that I'm making is, instead of being 3 years, is only going to be 2 years to reset the stagger, that isn't somehow in conflict. And so it takes a lot of research to go through this and make sure that we're not upsetting that. And if that's the case, we might need to put a stipulation here that this applies not to those boards, that it only applies to the rest of our committees. Committees like parking, traffic, and safety that are the staggers off where almost everyone rotates in the same year. That's who this would apply to then. So I guess that's where we are. And I'd love to hear from the rest of the committee on your thoughts on this, because this was kind of our initial take. And if we want to, I think it's reasonable to keep moving forward, but I would love to hear from the rest of you.
Well, I think that's a good plan. Again, we have to look at the statute and understand how to do it specifically. The only other thing that I would like to see is that the new appointments don't bypass the alternates on these committees. That an alternate is there, should probably have the first opportunity to, advance to a full member, and the new appointment become an alternate. Again, I don't know if that's regulated by statute, but that has been the tradition, and so I think that's a good tradition, especially for the land use boards.
Okay.
I think we'll keep researching. We need to know what the statute requires us to do. Looking at our research that we did earlier in the year, for example, the planning board has 4 positions expiring next year, 5 in 2024. So clearly, we're, replacing almost half the planning board each of those 2 years. So that shows you the degree of the problem. There's no quick way to fix it. We have to do it over time. And I don't know about lengthening a person's term. Certainly, I think where we've gotten into trouble is people have been appointed to fill out a term, and then they just keep going. So if the mayor was able to say, you're going to fill out the remainder of this term, that's the shortened appointment. That gets it back on track. But whatever is the simplest, surest way to get to the staggered terms that the statute requires, that's what we're after. And then the other topic is, when do these terms expire? But I think we'll get into that. That's a separate topic, right?
Yes, we will address that next, actually.
Yeah. And then I assume, as with every action of the mayor with appointments, it still requires approval by the council, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it would appear this language gets us to the desired goal. And I think it feels more natural to shorten a term than to appoint with extended terms. I think that stretches the power of the mayor a little more than maybe the statute envisions.
Okay. Thank you, Councilor Tabor. Yes.
So as the legal department continues to look at this and that intersection between the state law, in my recollection is that perhaps some of the lack of stagger that we see is also due to the fact that, and I think Bob shared this over the years, which is some board members have been allowed to hold over for a period of time while the process was in the way to either reappoint or to find someone new. So that goes to that. That may be one way to help with the land use boards. Maybe it's just allowing a couple month holdover to just push us into another year to then do another 3-year term. So we're going to look at that closely. As a, maybe that's one of those methods that has to be kept in mind if we don't have the ability to adjust. But I think some of the historical sort of off, the off cycle has just been because someone held over for 3 months while someone else was coming on board, and things kind of backed up a little bit. So, we'll look at all of those options, because it may be you take language, something like you have proposed here, and just add to the extent permitted by law, knowing that some of these are governed by state law and they will have a different solution than some of the other pieces. That might be an easy adjustment. And I just want to say, in terms of the alternates, I think, I hear that, there is value in kind of looking at the alternates, but I think like with any board member, you want to look at, have they been consistent in attendance? Have they, performed the function that we would expect of a board member, depending on the board that they're sitting at? So trying to hold them all accountable in terms of their actions on the board and whether they are participating. Yeah, so that would be my only caveat, that it's not you automatically get it if you're an alternate. Obviously, when you're seated, you are, but it's apply, and maybe there's a preference, but recognizing we ought to look carefully.
Right. I have seen a situation where an alternate did not want to become a voting member, and that was fine, too. But I think they have to have the opportunity to be considered.
Thank you. I have 2 points that I want to be clear on for those at home and those watching. This will not affect anyone who's currently sitting on any of our committees or boards. It doesn't change the terms of anyone who's currently sitting. The only thing this language does, is it allows this mayor and likely the next mayor as well, because it'll probably take about 4 years, to shorten the terms of their own appointments to committees and boards to reset the stagger. So I just think it should be very clear to everyone, this doesn't impact anyone who's currently sitting. These are for future appointments. And as far as Councilor Lombardi's suggestion goes with regard to appointing alternates, I think it's reasonable to add language somewhere that says that the mayor shall first consider alternates who are eager to serve in a full role before considering others for appointments. I don't know that we can tie the mayor's hands. The mayor has complete control over appointments, but I think it's reasonable to at least make that request somewhere in the ordinance. And then the mayor will make that determination ultimately. Does that seem like a reasonable approach?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. If that is the case, I can work with the legal department on getting that language as well, if everyone agrees that that should be added as well to the ordinance.
No, I agree that, we shouldn't walk past the years of experience that the alternates have, particularly on the land use boards. They've learned what the role is, and I think it's easier to fill an alternate position than a voting position.
Okay.
But you always want to have a bench,
Good. I think the consideration is always consistency. That's the goal of all of this across all of our committees and boards, is making sure we have a healthy staggered rotation so we keep expertise. This would be in line with doing that as well. So I will gladly do that.
Okay.
Are there any other comments on this particular piece before we move forward?
It seems to me that I recall, and this might be just in our ordinance, but I thought it was in the state statute that if there is not a candidate to replace someone at the end of their term, that they can continue in that role. But maybe one thing to think about is, rather than continuing in that role and extending that term, it becomes a new term in the rotation of the appointment. I think it, in the past, has been just considered, well, you're still there and your term is extended. But one way to solve that is to say, well, okay, this is a new term.
Right. If you stay,
At the
you stay
beginning
for
of a
3
new
years.
term, and when they do find someone to replace that person, they take over that term.
I think that's a reasonable section. That's where we started, which was trying to define places on committees versus persons. That there are places that hold 3-year terms versus an individual. So that way, that person serves that 3-year term, and if they leave early, somebody else fills that place, and that term still
And if
expires.
they leave late, it becomes a new term that someone would replace as well.
That works fine once you have the stagger reestablished.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
All right, then, let's move on to the second part of our committee's ordinance review discussion, appointment schedule. If everyone would recall, this is a discussion about the time frame in which appointments are made, and concerns about like depoliticizing any appointments and reducing the sense of residents that there is any kind of political, political action taken with appointments. We want to make sure that everyone has confidence that the mayor and the council then are appointing people based upon expertise, and that we're doing that with the authority that's invested in the mayor and the council. And so there were some concerns around appointments that occur after elections and prior to seating of a new council or a new mayor. And we had initially had some discussion here about moving those. So I would love to hear from my fellow councilors on what we think is the ideal approach here before we move forward with trying to shift those terms. I should note that the time frame of terms, like when those appointments occur, is not defined anywhere in our ordinance. So it's not an ordinance change to change this.
Is it statute?
Not really. I mean,
Oh, I
it
mean-
is, but it isn't. Yes. Not-
So the turnover date of the appointments is not in the statute, the state statute.
I'm familiar with the land use statute, and there's no turnover date in that
Okay.
particular appointment requirement for the land use boards, whether it's in the ordinances. So maybe it's just a matter of practice.
It's at this point, it's only defined by what the council votes on as the term of an appointment at the time they vote it. So.
Other than the land use boards, I mean,
including the land use boards. But, you know, fundamentally, there's an election the first Tuesday of November. There's a lame duck period. Most of our land use boards expire, their terms expire December 31 at midnight. The new council isn't sworn in until usually January 7th or so, the first Monday after New Year's. So I think that poses the question, that gives the lame duck council a lot of appointments that expire December 31. Having been through this 2 times, I've seen the 2017 council appoint a number of land use board positions as lame ducks, and the incoming 2019 council was unhappy about that. I've seen the 2019 council appoint a number, even more lame duck appointments, and our current council was vocal about that. So, but I think the question is what's best for the city, and I think that's the discussion we ought to have. Should these terms be appointed by the new council, and maybe the old terms expire, you know, early January? Or should we continue to expire them December 31st, which usually requires the lame duck council to fill a bunch of positions? And I think there's been a past precedent that the incoming council has allowed the outgoing council to make appointments. Is that what we want to continue to do? Or do we want the new appointments to reflect the latest desires of the voters by having the new council appoint them? I tend to lean that way, but there's been precedent both ways. You know, when we've had councils that didn't have a lot of turnover term to term, they were sort of trusted to fill out, to keep the land use boards staffed, even after some of them were either not elected or chose to retire. But we've had big swings in the makeup of the council, bigger swings than we used to have. So that's the way I see it. I tend to think it should reflect. I mean, our ultimate boss is the voters. So how do we get as close to what the voters want? And that, to me, seems that you let the new council, have those appointments.
I know that on the HDC, some appointments end in June, and some appointments end in end of December. I don't know if there's an advantage to having 2 separate dates. But I just wonder if June is a better date to have everything change. The terms end. It's the center of a year.
It's the fiscal year.
It's the fiscal year. So I guess I would propose that, June 30 is or June 1st, whichever, is a better time to make those changes than the end of the calendar year. So that, I think that would address this issue.
It's also worth noting that, for example, planning all expire December 31st. Trustees of trust funds expire January 1st. So there's not consistency in what we have now.
I think from what I can tell, we're kind of all on the same page about these, the issue of terms expiring a certain period of time. When I go through the list of committees where the terms expire in November or December, that's audit. There's one term on Economic Development Commission. I think that's somebody that was appointed and given a full term versus filling out a term. Then the next one to consider is Planning Board, Trustees of Trust Funds, and Zoning.
And what?
Zoning Board.
Zoning.
So those are all the ones that have expiration of terms between councils. And I think it's absolutely, I think you cannot shorten anyone's term. I think the only path you can take is lengthening terms, which means you can't move those appointment schedules back to before an election. They would have to be moved forward to January or February at a minimum. That way a new council's seated to make those appointments, because that reflects, as Councilor Tabor argued, the will of the voters as well. And if you were to do that, that would mean that you had all those rotations occurring with the new council, and you would eliminate, I guess, any of the challenges around appointments in November and December. And to be fair, as far as the council schedule goes, December is a very busy month for everyone, and November can be as well. You don't necessarily have a huge number of residents who might be interested in serving on one of these boards or committees paying attention to that appointment schedule in November and December. You might actually get more excited parties who are interested in serving in January, when people are thinking, I want to take on something new at the beginning of the year, after the holiday schedule. So it might be better as well as far as recruiting goes, to move into that time frame. So I don't, because we don't have an ordinance that covers this or any, really any procedure beyond the fact that this is how it's been done. These are when these appointments were initially made. So that's why those are the dates we have for the appointments. There's not clear guidance on how we make a recommendation to shift this, and to shift these appointments. So I'm happy to go back to the city clerk and work with the city clerk and with the legal department if we all think that this might be something we want to propose to the council, to find out how we would shift back these appointment dates. That would mean that anyone currently sitting on the committees I named would be serving for an additional, we would be asking them to be willing to serve for an additional month or two, and for their terms to end later. So Does that seem reasonable?
I think, well, you make the clear point that we can't shorten terms. So that means the remedy for this would be to lengthen the terms into January as the only practical way to do it. And wouldn't the enabling language reside in our descriptions of each of the boards and committees? You know, when we describe the terms will be 3 years or 5 years or whatever, and then we would specify the dates, right? And it seems like Councilor Cook, you and I have a sentiment that making these appointments in January when the new council is seated makes sense. But I'd like to hear the arguments both ways, you know. For many years, the precedent has been to do it December 31st, that these expire December 31st. It made for some unusual circumstances this past year because only 2 of us stayed on the council. So 7 members of the council turned over. So you really had a whole fresh look, as the voters wanted.
Okay.
I mean, I think that well, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's it doesn't. I just suggested June because it was maybe a convenient
No,
date.
it has a lot of logic to it.
But January too, it's in some ways, if there's a new mayor who, I mean, potentially has not even been a city councilor, to start making these appointments, I think would be very difficult for that person. That's why I thought maybe a little more time in the seat might be good. Even for a mayor who's been on the council. The role is, yes, he's a counselor, he or she's a counselor, but that job has a lot going on that the rest of us don't have. So I just wonder if that's a big task to ask somebody who just a month earlier found out that they're mayor.
Right. Month and 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Maybe what we could do is I will start asking the city clerk and the legal department if this is a reasonable approach, if it's something that we can move forward with, and how we would make that recommendation since it's not an ordinance. And then we can also ask the city to weigh in on what that initial month looks like and whether or not that is a reasonable time, or we should move it out further depending upon what tasks look like at the beginning of the year. I'm trying to be mindful of the fact that when we get to February, we're doing the CIP budget, and then, so there's so much budget discussion there at the beginning of the year that I want to make sure that if we do move these, we move them to a time where the mayor would not be incredibly busy with other tasks, so that the mayor would have time to vet candidates appropriately. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
How would we, let's take Vince's argument that June at least gives a new mayor a chance to get their feet wet and understand what's happening. But how would we shift these terms from ending December 31 to ending June 30? We'd have to do that one at a time, right? Or extend everybody for one time by 6 months. So the planning board they'd serve 3 years and 6 months, or 2 years, and whatever that additional increment would mean. But I suppose you could do it.
I think you'd have two options here. The first option would that the mayor would appoint somebody to fill a role for an additional, like change the term on appointment and say your term will expire in June versus in December. But the only way the mayor could do that is not to lengthen the term, but to shorten it slightly. So it would be shortening some appointments in making these appointments. The other alternative is to take everyone who's sitting and serving and say, we're just going to lengthen your terms, and so that the appointments don't come up until a certain time frame. So there are two approaches, I think, that you could take.
And this may be another question like Councilor Denton's proposed changes, where we want to ask our panel of former mayors and get their lived experience of this. It would be interesting to hear over all of this was, I think there was enough continuity in the previous councils that it wasn't it didn't raise much concern. But when councils change dramatically at the desire of the voters, that's when the issue becomes interesting. So it would sound to me like we're exploring January, we're exploring June, but it would be good to know what were the benefits of the long-time precedent before that.
I agree with that.
I think it would be reasonable, absolutely, to bring in some former mayors and ask this question. I would specifically turn to mayors who had served before we had any questions about appointments. Maybe asking Mayor Farini to come in. Mayor Spear, I believe, came in.
Mayor Blaylock.
Yeah, maybe avoid Mayor Blaylock since there were some questions or concerns, but have some earlier mayors who, before there were any questions or concerns about appointments occurring in by anybody in November and December. Since Councilor Tabor pointed out earlier, there were questions about the 2017 council as well. Is that right? 2019 council?
Yeah, the incoming council wanted their shot at appointments. And the outgoing council said, well, we have to keep these boards running. And according to the deadlines, the only way to do that by December 31st is to make an appointment.
Right.
So,
Yeah. I think the goal here is to eliminate that discussion
right.
so that there should never be a competition between an outgoing council and an incoming council on appointments. It should just be consistency across councils and no concerns about politicizing anything. I think that would help encourage our residents to think that the council's doing its work and that we're not, that it isn't politicized in any way. Its appointments especially. I think that's the goal. Okay. Well, I'll start with the clerk's office and legal department
Okay.
to see how this is done. And then I will have the legal department reach out to each of you, since I cannot do that because don't want to create quorum. If we have a reasonable idea of how this could be approached before our next meeting, and we're ready to invite anyone else to come in. Is that fair? Mm-hmm. Okay.
I would just say that all appointments are political. No,
Yeah.
no matter when.
Right, I think the idea that a council would be elected and not want their views expressed in the appointments would be naive.
It's reasonable. So, okay. We will move forward then. We're ready to discuss the next item. We need to come up with, as a committee, due to our recommendation on discussion of parks, spaces within the city, and referring that to the Recreation Board, the Conservation Commission, and Trees and Public Greenery, and possibly the Planning Board for further discussion. We should probably come up with an agenda for them so they are aware, and a format for that meeting. So that's why I'm raising that here today. Asking them just to come together without any insight into what they're going to discuss is a little bit difficult. So I thought it would be important for us to discuss what are our priorities for them coming out of a meeting. Do we want them to meet? It's probably unreasonable asking them all to meet together, but asking representatives from each to meet to have a discussion. Do we want to also be present as governance committee, or do we want them to have the discussion without us? Do we just want to define the agenda and ask them to ask questions on that agenda and come to answer questions only? What do we see as the format of that meeting?
I guess, since I kind of brought this up, I think, my thought is that it's not really a governance thing at this point, and that, but I would like to see a committee of these groups addressing, the open space holistically. And I don't even know what that means in terms of this. But I think each of these boards and commissions have an interest in the open space. And I would trust it to them to find a way, and maybe they'll say, nah, this isn't going to go anywhere. But I would hope that kind of an overall view of the city's public spaces would be important enough that these various, I would say, bents on how to use those spaces or how to best manage those spaces could come together and define that in a better way.
This came out of our discussion of should we have a parks board. And I think our discussion around a parks board was twofold. Without one, who advocates to add green space? We know on all our master plans, residents are always saying, we treasure green space, we want green space, we want view corridors, viewscapes, especially to the water. Who produces the program of work to find those? And second, with the parks that we have, what's the right mix of active and passive uses. There's, for example, this, obviously Prescott Park has really active uses, especially in the summer. But what about Jones Avenue? What about some of the other areas? And I think it would be helpful so if we say there's two questions, how do we advocate to always be finding and adding green space for the public to use? And then what's the right mix of active and passive uses of what we have? And then have a list of what we have. Because I don't think people realize how long that list is. Does that make sense? Those are...
I think that's a reasonable approach. I mean, that's what we're asking. I think that I would add one more thing to that. And the reason I put possibly a planning board member on the agenda was that we're approaching the master planning process soon. And I think that they probably need to have recommendations of some kind. These committees need to come together and make some recommendations for the master planning process. And the planning board should be aware then of what the concerns are around open space. And that way we have a better master planning process. So I think that they should be mindful of that.
It's interesting, there's a 23-acre parcel that approached the city and said, a lot of this is wetlands. Could there be a conservation easement on it? Could there be a public use of it? Where does that land? That's an interesting opportunity. Could you have trails on it? Could you have dirt bike trails or hiking trails or so how do we, that would be my question for this group when we gather them. How do we take advantage of opportunities as they arise? I think particularly out in the the south on Route 1 over by down near Heritage Ave and those areas behind Water Country. There's lots of interesting chunks of land. The Great Bog near the plains. So.
Yes, Deputy City Manager.
So what I'm wondering is, would it make sense to, like I wrote down the two big questions, who advocates to add green space and what is the right mix of active and passive uses of our green spaces? If, and maybe a third, depending on how the conversation wraps up, but should we take those questions maybe and send them to each of the boards and say, would you like to designate a member or two to have a meeting to talk about and answer these, or would you, or does your board want, I'm trying to think of a good format because it might be hard given scheduling to get all of the boards together, but the boards might be interested in designating a person or two to respond to these, or maybe the board would want to address them their own, on their own, and then feed it back to this committee. I'm not sure there's a wrong way to do it. There might be an easier way to do it, but yeah, I will say that, and I think I mentioned this before, that historically when the city has identified potential parcels, as in a property owner comes to us, typically it does get vetted a bit internally and will go to the city council, sometimes in non-public session if it involves the potential, transfer of real estate, for a fee. But these do get brought up to the city council level. And sometimes it's part and parcel, if you may recall, of some of our public works projects where we may need a small part of the property, but the owner is interested in selling the city the whole part of the property. That happened recently off of Banfield Road. So those opportunities are, to some degree, coming forward. It may not be every opportunity, but sometimes it gets some vetting internally, and obviously to the extent we're using conservation funds for property, then it goes to the Conservation Commission for its input before it goes to the City Council. But ultimately, it's the City Council that makes decisions, obviously, in terms of acquisition of land and interest in land. So it is, those opportunities are moving forward when they look like they have some legs. That doesn't mean there's not value and further input, but so.
I'm always thinking that it would be valuable to have further discussion around when easement opportunities arise, around things like how can we put a bike path here that connects two roads, or connects to the rail trail, the envisioned rail trail, or connects that maybe we need to have a vision for where would we like to have more walking pathways that connect, or viewpoints to the water that are public access, or even public access spaces where people could approach the water and put a kayak in, for example, or that kind of thing.
I'm wondering if it might be useful to have the planning director come to the next meeting along with Eric Eby, because between the two of them, a lot of this is that interconnectivity. And I know we had Peter Britz here previously, and he talked about some of the open space land, but to figure out how to best get the input from the boards that you're looking for, or how this will eventually play into the master planning process, or updating the bike ped plan. We have some of that planning that was done and may need to be updated because obviously conditions change, and that's why you do your master planning process. But if that would be helpful to have a more robust conversation than I can carry on, because it's not my normal wheelhouse, I'm certainly willing to bring other players to this committee to help figure out how we advance this in a way that's most effective for you and for the boards.
I have a question around that, because I think it would be important for the planning director to be involved in this discussion and planning to be involved. But my question is really, should we have them come here, or should we help set an agenda of what our questions are and try to draw together individuals from these groups who actually have some expertise around this to discuss this with the planning director, so that we make sure that there's further discussion around parks? I do think that there's another question that needs to be answered. Who should be responsible as far as committees go for parks? And that probably is a discussion among the committees. Which committee makes the most sense to be responsible for parks? Is it the Recreation Committee? Should it become Parks and Recreation? Is it Trees and Public Greenery? Should that become Parks? That handles trees and public greenery? Where does that responsibility lie?
Well, right now it lies with Public Works, with the input on taking down trees, with Trees and Greenery, with Recreation in terms of what programming is held there or what the facilities are put in. So that's where it sits right now. And then obviously through the City Council, because you ultimately control the budget and, help us decide priorities on, what we're doing, for infrastructure or not
Right.
in those green spaces or acquisitions. So,
Yeah, and that had been the initial concern. I know Public Works does a fantastic job maintaining spaces, but there's there's no one at the committee level thinking about what are our next steps for developing new spaces, or for using the spaces we have differently, or approaching them differently, like putting a boardwalk at the Great Bog or something like that, or where's our next acquisition for public space. So
Yeah, I think that part of the overview has to do with the kind of the competing interests of each of these existing boards. If, you know, because there are, I mean, the Conservation Commission, they're interested in conservation, recreation, you know, and is it passive or active recreation? I have the same question, you know, how are those decisions made, where there are competing interests? And I think right now, it's basically Public Works, does it, you know, with input from the city council ultimately, but.
And I think if the responsibility lies with Public Works, Public Works views their job as keeping everything in good condition. And they plan that sequentially, and budget that, and assign manpower to that, and they do a great job. But there's parks as something to maintain, and there's recreation and green space as an experience. And I think I'm asking who's responsible for the experience part. What do our people experience, our residents experience in all these, and what are the opportunities for that?
Okay, so I've got 3 questions now. We just have to decide how you would like to get your input, whether it's to, you know, send these questions to each of the boards, whether you want to have an opportunity to talk to, you know, the planning director and Eric Eby first, in case you want to tweak these a little bit before you send them off, or get their input on how you know, what's the best strategy for reaching out. So
Well, I personally would love to hear from the planning director, and maybe Eric too. You know, I mean, he's the data
sensitive
person.
to the bike ped
Yeah.
pieces, yeah.
yeah.
So I think that would be useful.
Okay.
I think that's a good next step. It occurs to me that this could be a kind of colloquium event where the discussion is facilitated between all these players around those questions. And maybe there's breaking into small groups and coming back with, you know, multidisciplinary groups coming back with answers to questions, and there might be some policy coming out of that.
I see this very much as a kickoff discussion for master planning down the road for parks. And if you kick off this discussion and people start having the talks between these specific committees and planning, then organically we will end up with a solution for who addresses parks
Right.
in the long run. So I think that would be fantastic. I think, though, what we will have to do is we might have to set a date and invite people to attend rather than asking people when they can, because we'll never get a date. I think that that's one of those challenges, unless we just kind of choose and set a date.
Right.
Yeah.
And there may be some ways to engage the public in that, too. Certainly if it got preview coverage and... So, and I agree, you know, as we get closer to starting a master plan, these are all the things to think about. Maybe there's a parks and green space element to the master plan, which we haven't had before. So,
Yeah. Okay, so it seems to me like we want to hear from the planning director,
Yeah.
if possible, at our next meeting.
Okay.
Set a date, January 5th.
So if we could bring in, I guess,
For the next governance committee.
yes,
Let me see if she's.
I think at a minimum, it would be helpful for the planning director to know what we're thinking and the planning around this.
Yep.
Because we also don't want to get in the way of the planning department if they have any plans to do something of this sort. So I think that that's also critical to remember. And that will be our next steps. The last thing on our agenda, new committee member orientation materials. And I would note that the deputy city attorney has been working on this, or deputy city manager, I should say. Deputy.
Excuse me.
You're still the deputy city attorney as well?
Holding a lot of hats.
Yeah.
Has been working on this and is sharing with us
Is this a new version?
new.
No, we're still
orientation
trying to
materials.
tweak to get the formatting such
Yeah.
that, got a little spacing we're still dealing with, but we recently brought on a new member of the Cable Commission.
Yes.
And it was interesting because the existing members, quickly did a review of what you should and should not do as a committee member on their own about emails. And I thought, well, that was great. And I would like to, I got to fix some formatting bits and pieces here, but we were trying to come up with something that, rather than the page of white text that, people say, oh, here's a handout I should read, and then they put it aside, that this might be visually attractive enough and short enough that at least it would get people, the new committee members, thinking and asking questions or double checking with their committee members or their chair or whatever staff person. So it really is meant to be almost a prop rather than an exhaustive, here's what to do and not do from a public records point of view, and here's why we do certain things like keep minutes. And, Kelly, the city clerk, could, provide them to each new committee member, just as to kind of spark it off. It's not meant to be exhaustive. It's just meant to be, oh, wait, if I'm not clear on something, I should ask someone. So that was our thought, something just to be a prompt for some conversations about public records and minutes and social media, so that they'd come in a little more attentive and mindful to some of these basic things, particularly for some of our smaller committees that they're doing good work, but may not be they may be new to committee work, and so.
I think this is great.
So this was really, based on the conversations we had early on this year in this committee about helping people understand their obligations. So.
And I know that, well, the packet that was put together for the council, and I also know the packet that's put together for new HDC members is very thorough as well. But those are both pretty heavy duty.
Yeah.
As opposed to this.
Right, this was meant to be the light lift for some, for people on our smaller committees, again, doing important work, but, maybe aren't ready to read a 5-page, here's what you need to do and not do, and again, to get the conversation going, so.
no, it's great. It's the voice of experience. It's really boiled down to the do's and don'ts.
I know that I love this. I think it's really helpful. And one of the things that I really loved coming in as a new city councilor were all the videos about different departments that we watched
That
as
was
city
great.
councilors to learn about what all the departments are and what they do. I think it was incredibly helpful.
Who they are.
Who the people are. I think it would be wonderful also if we had some type of orientation videos that we set up for everyone serving on any board or committee, only because people take in information differently in different ways. Some people respond better to a video, and it's helpful for them to understand not just the general information of these are the rules, this is how we do it, but why we do it that way.
Yeah.
I think it's particularly difficult for new people serving to understand the legal side of service and what the legal protections are or not when you're serving, not just as an elected official, but also on a committee, especially a quasi-judicial board as well, helping them just to get kind of general background on why things work a certain way and how they actually work, I think would be helpful. You could just have a few quick videos, and you could ask
Made a note.
someone to make
Bob.
those. Yes, you could
What I
ask
was thinking.
our incoming legal consultant who likes to do videos to do those as well, just so that people fully understand
Yeah.
their role and responsibilities.
Yeah, I agree. The multi-modalities,
Yeah.
because we all learn differently, and,
Right.
yeah.
Right. I think people also have continuing questions.
Yeah.
You know, I still have questions around, personnel issues and what you discuss in non-public session versus a public session, what's allowed, and that's minutia in the law around personnel matters. You know, people devote their entire careers to law around human resources. So those are things that I don't know. And so I'm always kind of asking those little questions. So I think it's helpful for people to understand.
And it's really important to understand, obviously coming from the Fourth Estate and a newspaper background, for our volunteers to understand why we have to do all this business in public. Because it's onerous. It's not easy. But if they understand the philosophy behind that of, everything we do is open and visible, and it's hard to get to that, but the alternative is worse.
Okay. Okay.
This is great.
Yes.
Step
Keep
one.
going.
Step
Keep
one.
going.
Thank you again.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Other business? The first thing I have under other business is our meeting schedule and making sure that we have enough meetings. We should probably go out to the end of the year at this stage, I would think. We have a meeting scheduled for the 31st,
Right.
I should note. But I was concerned because things start booking up when you get into November and December again. So I wanted to check on everyone's schedule for November and then December. If we were to move out 2 weeks from our meeting on the 31st, that puts us on a council night. In the past, we've tried to avoid that. So we could go either 1 week or we could go 3 weeks. So that would be November 7th or November 21st.
January, you mean?
No, November.
Oh.
For governance. So we have a governance meeting just October 31st.
Right.
And the challenge is then we get into November and
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, well, you get, a lot of family time.
A lot of family time, exactly. And that's why I thought we should approach this now.
Yeah. Well, I guess I have no problem having it the same day as city council.
Okay. Like on the 14th,
Yeah.
the 14th. Counselor Tabor, how do you feel about that?
Well, we certainly, that's really the only shot.
Right. We could do the 21st, but I don't know that everyone will be in town because it's the week of Thanksgiving, and
Of Thanksgiving.
people have a tendency to either travel early or travel late.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Yeah. I know I'm not available the 28th
yeah.
because that's fall break for us, not just Thanksgiving, so.
Yeah, and that's the Monday after Thanksgiving. Some people travel.
Exactly. So we can do the 14th, if everyone is comfortable with that on a city council day. Okay. So I'm going to pencil us in then for governance. Monday, the 14th at 10 a.m.
Okay.
And that would mean we have one meeting in November. Then we get to December. And the first Monday in December is again a city council meeting day. We could go to the second, the 12th of December, if that's better for everyone. I should note, though, that after that, we can't meet the 19th, and then we'll have, we have because of the Hanukkah holiday,
Right.
and then we have Christmas holidays, and then, so
So what are you saying, the 12th?
the 12th of December, if we want to avoid that 5th, the date on the 5th. And if for some reason we feel like we need to meet more than once in December,
Yeah.
we can always come back and add a date in.
Is the only other city council meeting on the 14th?
At the moment,
Yes,
it's the
Okay.
5th and the
the
14th.
5th and the 14th. They're right on top of each other because of the holidays.
Yeah,
The holiday schedule, so,
well, I know, but just
yeah.
making sure there's not another one somewhere.
I don't think so. Let's hope not.
So you want to do it on the 12th?
Does the 12th work in December for you? Okay.
It's okay.
I think that's probably the best thing we can do at the moment. And because we don't have the council schedule yet for January, then I think we should probably wait to schedule for January.
Yeah.
We'll have the council scheduled by December. We'll be able to then schedule out for January, February.
But it will pattern the same as,
Yeah, wouldn't it be
previous
the
year,
same
just-
pattern,
Yeah, I
basically?
think it'd be pretty similar.
yeah.
We probably will be meeting in January before the first council meeting, because the council meeting seems to come a little bit later.
Well, we'll have two council meetings, I'm sure, in January.
Yeah.
I think.
So we're probably looking at a January 9th meeting,
Yeah.
is my guess.
Yeah, the 16th is a holiday.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, 9th and 23rd, 1st and 3rd.
Right.
Okay.
So for governance, too? Is
Well-
that what you want to do? or-
Well, that's the question for governance then, because there's a holiday on the 16th.
Yeah,
You're stuck with one of the council days,
yeah.
or waiting almost a month and a half before you meet again. Or moving it to a Wednesday. And that's kind of those are the options in January. I don't ever love moving the day of the week because I think it becomes more challenging for not just getting the room, but
Yeah,
it becomes confusing to people who are used to coming on Mondays. So we could also pencil in a date for
but the
January.
9th would be 3 weeks from the previous governance meeting, right? Mm-hmm. But that will
Well-
probably be also a city council meeting, yeah.
The 9th would be 4 weeks out. Just fairly significant time
Yeah.
frame. I mean, it's a month
Yeah.
between meetings, so,
Well, that would be normal for the holidays, though.
right.
Yeah.
I would just hate to push it to the 23rd. I think that's pushing it a little bit far, and because of the holiday, we can't do it on the 16th.
So we should put in the 9th for now.
Yeah.
Going back to November, though,
Yes.
that's the only council meeting of the month.
Correct.
So those do tend to stack up with long agendas.
They do. That's going to be a long day. That's the thing I'm worried about. I don't think you put 1 week between meetings. And I don't know, I'm not traveling on the 21st, but I don't know if either one of you are. And so that's what I don't want to,
Yeah, I'm not.
I don't want you to be in a
That's the beauty
situation
of
where
a
you're.
three-person committee.
Well,
Are you,
no, I'm not, I may be traveling that week, but, oh, no, not on November, no, sorry.
November the 21st, the first day before, the Monday before Thanksgiving?
Yeah,
So we could move it?
just have to pick up the turkey, I guess.
Okay. Well, if that's the case, maybe we should go ahead and move the 14th to the 21st. I'm good with that.
I think so.
Yeah, that's good. I think
I'm
that's
not-
fine.
Okay.
I'm not traveling that. Let's do that.
Yeah,
And then we're not stacked up against a council day.
right.
Yeah.
It's like a long
Yeah.
day's journey into night.
Whenever we can avoid it, it's the best practice to do so. I think January is more difficult because of the holiday in there.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're a few months out now. Then upcoming committee topics. I should also let you know we still have the sidewalk policy on our list. We have a donations policy coming up that we have to discuss. We also still have to review the conflict of interest provisions in our ordinance, and I'm sure there will be more. With that said, is there anything else, I should say, upcoming committee topics that I should be watching for that you think we need to raise that's not on our list?
We probably will start talking about the master plan, although that responsibility lies with zoning. That's the zoning board. So, never mind.
Okay. All right.
I don't know.
If there's nothing for now, of course, we'll be able to discuss this in every single meeting. You can always raise an issue. If you want to add an issue to the agenda, please reach out to Cynthia in the legal department so that we can get that on the agenda. I'm going to open the floor for public comment. Is there anyone who wants to speak? No? Okay, and there's no one on Zoom, so we have no public comment today.
Move to adjourn.
Is there a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We're adjourned.